Steph Smith from Doing Content Right. Thank you very much for joining me to talk about your book. But first of all, I'd love to ask, do you consider this a book?
It's funny because I feel like I probably called it a book. I've probably called it a course. I had no idea what it was going to be when I first created it. In fact, I think it originally was a long blog post that ended up being too long to be a blog post, so it ended up being a book. So I guess most people refer to it as a book, but I guess it also has several other elements like videos or a quiz and exercises. So you could also call it a course, but I think most people call it a book.
Yeah, the thing that I had in mind is it's like an evolving book because the content that you created is not finished, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic that is evergreen in nature, right? People since the beginning of time have created content and will continue to do that. And so yes, I tried to make the book itself relatively evergreen, meaning someone who bought it in 2020 would get value, but also someone reading the same book in 2025 would. But because content does evolve, I have been adding new chapters or new elements to it. And also, I find that's a good way to reward customers because they bought into something at one time, hopefully got value at that time, but then will be even happier if they get, another chapter, another bonus, or another something later on.
Yeah, that's great part of the deal because I was in your podcast session just 1 or 2 weeks ago, and I felt great that I could be part of that community after having bought something, and then I can be back in a few months maybe, and there'll be an update.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and who is it for exactly?
So it's for anyone that wants to create content online. So content is obviously this like broad term, but to start, it was mostly people who wanted to write a blog or a newsletter, especially I feel like when I first published it in 2020, newsletters were all the rage at the time. But it's important to keep in mind that as you mentioned, content is also podcasts, it's also YouTube channels. It's basically any way that we're communicating online with other people. It's people trying to grow their Twitter followings. And so it was interesting because when I created the book, I hadn't started a podcast of my own. And I basically went back to the book after I'd launched a podcast and was like, does this apply to podcasts? Like, is this applicable past writing? And it was kind of pleasant to go back to my own work and be like, yeah, actually, this does apply to podcasts. This does apply to YouTube channels. It obviously doesn't get into the nitty gritty of like how to record on YouTube and how to publish and how to game that algorithm. But basically, to get back to your question, it is broadly anyone who's trying to create content online, but the people who probably can benefit from it the most are people looking to write content online.
Yeah, and do you think the main focus is on newsletter writers or blog posts?
So, one of the main, I guess, ideas in the book is that a lot of people stray towards more, I'd say, easier channels to grow on. So, things like Twitter or, trending on Hacker News. But one of the best distribution channels that people are, I'd say, under leveraging, which is surprising because a lot of people are leveraging it, is SEO, right? Ranking on Google
Yeah,
because it has that bedrock. So, to your question, a lot of people who read the book start out with a newsletter and think that that is what they're focusing on. But I actually would push people and do push people in the book to focus more on blogging because ultimately, as a newsletter writer, it's really hard to grow if the only way that you're actually like producing content is in that one-to-one relationship with your newsletter subscribers. And instead, what they can do is just take parts of that content or augment that content with blog pieces that actually do have more of that shareability and discoverability on Google.
yeah. Would you recommend that to an author? So someone's just writing a normal book. Would you recommend them to leverage SEO?
It depends. So SEO is really, really important if you are looking to do this in the long term. And I think most people are. And if you're looking to, as I say in the book, like get off the hamster wheel, because if you're focusing on just ranking on something like Hacker News or having your stuff shared on social, you're basically dependent on the work that you do today to bring you results instead of something more like a dividend, right? So I view SEO as a dividend. Now, if you're writing a book, you may not care as much about that long term kind of like long tail. You may just be happy with like a big book launch that brings you some money and then after that it kind of dies down and maybe it doesn't die down because word of mouth kind of sustains it. But if you are interested in kind of launching something like a book and having that continue to be relevant and also driving almost like passive traffic to that book, then yes, I would say that that person, that author could benefit from learning more about SEO and implementing that so that again, they're getting off that hamster wheel. They write the book once, but then 1 to 5 years from then, people are still finding the book on their own through that traffic.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. Another topic. So the pricing of your book is something I'd love to dedicate some time to because It's now $200, I think. It was sold
Yes.
for $100 for a while. How did you come up with this pricing?
Yeah, so it has evolved over time as I've experimented over time, but actually it started at $10. So when I first decided to create whatever this was going to be, and I say that because again, it wasn't originally going to be a book, or I didn't know it would kind of evolve into that. I found this old blog post that was what I originally was looking to do. I launched my blog in some point in 2019, and then by mid 2019, I had gotten traction, and I went and started to write this long blog post. But the outline itself was several thousand words, and so I kind of got overwhelmed and left it to the side. And later on, rediscovered it. And when I rediscovered it, I basically was debating, do I want to create this? Do I want to put the effort in? Does anyone even care about this if I
Hmm.
create it? And so I tweeted about that and I said, hey, everyone, like I have this long outline, this long blog post. If I create this, would people pay $10 for it? And again, I don't even think I said this is going to be a book. I just said, if I create this, like, will someone pay?
Okay,
And
sorry, can I interrupt a second? How many
yeah,
followers did you have at the time?
I think somewhere between 6 to 7,000
Okay.
in that range. Yeah. So some, yeah. So I did have a following, but I think a lot of people looking back now because my following is much bigger are like, oh, you were so successful because you had 50,000 followers, and it was like, no, that a lot of those followers actually came through the success of
Uh-huh.
the book. And so yes, I tweeted it and I got quite a few replies of people being like, yeah, I would totally buy it, like take my credit card now. And even a few people who were like, I would actually pay more for this, you should charge more. And it was just those few people. I think it was maybe three people who said something along those lines, and I just thought, like, should I charge more? And ultimately my issue was that I didn't know how to come to that answer, as in, like, if I'm going to charge more, what should it be? Should it be $15? Should it be $50? I'm seeing some people sell courses for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. Like, where should I price this? And I had no idea, especially because it was my first time charging for something
Hmm.
and putting something out there that people would pay for. So basically what I ended up doing is I work in growth marketing, like that's what I do for my full-time job. I said, why don't I just get some data on this, which basically meant it started at $10 and I think it was every either 30 or 50 sales, I can't remember now, it went up by $5. And that was an interesting way to get data, meaning that I could see how quickly the sales were coming at each tier. So at
Yeah.
$10, it like flew off the shelf, 15, 20, all of those were really quick. It really started to slow down around 30. And so that's when I was like, okay, so I'm going to leave it at 30. And that's what I did until launch. It was $30 until launch. And then even after launch, it was $30 for quite some time. And then I started playing around with pricing again as I got more reviews, more social proof, more people talking
Yeah.
about it. I thought, maybe this is actually pretty good. Maybe I can charge even more for this. I think it went up to 50 at some point. And then, as you said, it went up to 100 for quite some time. And it was there for probably around a year. And then
Yeah.
recently, I decided to play around a little more and I did this anti Black Friday sale, which basically meant I took the prices back down before Black Friday and they inched back up towards Black Friday, to which I doubled the prices instead of most companies. They
Yeah.
reduced the prices on Black Friday, I doubled them. And so ultimately, I'm just so happy with how this book is done that I can now be pretty, I don't know, experimental with the pricing.
Hmm.
And if it doesn't work out, that's fine. If it works out, it's fine. But yeah, that's kind of the price evolution since launch.
Yeah. Apart from this Black Friday or pre-Black Friday sale, did you ever drop the prices?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do sales often enough, right? So,
Hmm.
the prior Black Friday, I actually did drop prices as most companies do. And I'm, as I said, because it's really just me and I don't have these like growth goals or like a dashboard that I'm tracking and I'm like I need to hit this number. I am pretty experimental with it. So sometimes I just decide like, yeah, like let's just do a sale or let's just, let's double prices or let's just
Okay.
play around with it, get some data. And it is interesting because even with the like doubling to $200, like there was a couple days post that big Black Friday lead up where for the first time I didn't make any sales for, I'd say, around 3 days, which was the
Hmm.
first time ever. Right prior to that, there was maybe
Well,
like 1 or 2 days throughout the whole like 1.5 year period where there wasn't any sales. And so I was like, oh man, did I make a big mistake? But since then it started to pick back up again. And so it's just kind of fun to like see what happens. And again, I know some people don't have that luxury to
yeah.
just kind of be like messing around with their pricing. But I do think it's interesting. My takeaway after especially the first kind of experiment where it went up by $5 was that people don't experiment enough with their pricing. And in
Hmm.
fact, me doing that, I didn't think it was like revolutionary, and it wasn't. I'm sure many people have done that before. I had so many people reach out to me who were like, "Oh my gosh, can I copy this? Can I do this with my product?" And I was like, "Totally. This
Yeah.
isn't like patented. Like go for it." And I do think it has helped other creators as well make more money because there's that like, you know, there's that like social cue or psychological cue of like this is going to run out, and I want to get in early, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's fun to just play around with it.
Yeah. Do you think that normal books are maybe underpriced?
If it's a good book, definitely. I mean, the crazy part about books is, and this is actually something I talk about briefly in the book itself, is
Mm-hmm.
this idea of perceived value and the way that we anchor to particular kind of categories of products. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's the same content, people will scoff at paying $50 for a book, but they will pay $500 for the same course and not blink an eye. And it's the same phenomena as like the way that most people, including myself, struggle to pay more than 99 cents for an app, even if
Yeah.
that app saves us dozens of hours a year, right? And if you value your time, right, it's worth like potentially thousands of dollars to you. And so the same thing is true, I find, for a book where okay, there are a bunch of books that maybe won't teach you anything or maybe aren't worth anything, but the ones that are should be actually worth, hundreds if not thousands of dollars to you if you actually are learning something that changes your trajectory, or in the case of my book, if you are actually saving many hours of going the wrong direction in creating content, that actually should be worth a lot more than, the $10 that people are used to paying for books. But it is like a psychological thing where it's really hard to change people's minds because a lot of that is subconscious, right? If I were to sit down and have a conversation with someone and say, "Hey, you're planning to start a blog. Okay, do you know what you're doing?" And they say no. And I'd say, "What if I could save you 100 hours on the way to you launching a
Mm-hmm.
successful blog?" They'd be like, "All right, yeah, like I'll pay, $500 for that, or maybe thousands," and they'd be happy to do that. But if I were to say, "All right, here's my book," they'd be like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, no, no, no. I don't want to pay. I don't want to pay that much for a book," right? So it is
Yeah.
just this, like, subconscious thing that we are all programmed to do based on our anchoring towards certain categories of products.
Yeah. That's right. I feel like I would not pay more for a course, or I feel like an online course does not deserve more than $20, $30 unless it has video.
Yeah. But see, that's so interesting, right? Because I also feel similarly where we're like, when I look at courses online, if it has video, all of a sudden I'm like, oh yes, I would pay hundreds. I actually recently even, it was through our corporate learning budget, but like spent thousands on one
Yeah.
recently. And I wouldn't have done that if it was a book, right? And so it is interesting because even though it's the same content, I guess you could say that you actually make it easier for the end user, and therefore that's worth something. You're reducing that friction. But it is, I find fascinating that people, even if it's the exact same content, willing to pay hundreds for a course and no more than, $10 if it's a book.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Right. Moving on to the next topic. How did you get the idea for doing content right?
When I first started my blog itself, the blog that I wrote that ended up being successful, that inspired doing content, right? It was because I, as simple as it sounds, had a couple things that I just really wanted to say that I didn't see being said. For example, this was before the pandemic, but I was working remotely and I'd been doing that for years. And the topics or the way that remote work was being talked about, I just found really strange, as in most of it was done by like corporate entities that were, I don't know, trying to drive some narrative. And my one of my very first blog articles was like guide to remote work that's not trying to sell you anything. And it was just really like, here's actually what you need to know. And so my first couple articles, or really my blog itself, was driven by this idea that like there are just certain topics that I really have something to say about. And the book itself was similar to that, where I had seen so many other courses or books or people talking online about content in ways that I typically say are, at best they meant well, but it wasn't correct. So it was perhaps leading people in the wrong direction. Or at worst, it was like intentionally just like junk, right? Like they know they don't know what they're talking about, but they know that this will make them money. And so they're going to
Mm-hmm.
create a book or a course or whatever. And so I noticed that for a while as I was doing this work professionally, right? Like my job for the last several years has been like leading publications teams, building Trends, which is a paid subscription, being
Mm-hmm.
at the Hustle, which is one of the biggest newsletters in the world, and building up my own blog. So I had done the like gamut of things that you can do professionally. And so I felt like I knew what I was doing. And as I said, I noticed that many other people, I would say, again, we're kind of leading people astray. So I said, I think I can create something better. Again, as simple as that sounds, it was like that same instinct when I started my blog of like, I have something to say. And I actually think I can differentiate from the other stuff that's out there by just being higher quality, more honest, more transparent. And so that's what it started as. And then again, when I created it, I had no idea it would be like a 70,000 word book, but that just happened as I started to create. I was like, wow, I actually have more to say than I thought. But that's
Mm-hmm.
how the book was inspired.
Yeah. How do you feel about that honesty and that transparency now, like 2 years, 3 years later?
I feel the same way. I mean, all of my content revolves around that idea because I think I have the luxury of working full time separately from that. So everything that I create, and I've written about this topic as well, is just for fun or because, again, I have this like want or need to say something and almost like clarify
Hmm.
topics that I see a bunch of junk around. And so because I work full time and my financial stability is housed elsewhere, then I can be totally transparent, totally open, and share my numbers or not hit my numbers or not even have numbers, right?
Hmm.
Which I know not everyone has the luxury to do, but yes, I think that has been and will continue to be like a theme of most, if not all, of my work, because again, I have that financial stability elsewhere.
Yeah, that's so interesting. How do you feel about it, like the general market? Because I've been online, like in this type of community on Twitter, where everyone shares and tries to sell a course for only a bit more than a year, and I've noticed the same, like maybe problem that many people try to sell you something, and even though they know it's not really correct, but they pretend it is. I'm like wondering if in the last 2 or 3 years, do you think this has increased, decreased, still the same?
I mean, it's always been around. If you look back, even like decades ago, there's been people trying to sell stuff that
Hmm.
hasn't been high quality. But I think it maybe there's been more of it in the sense that for the first time, and it's a wonderful thing, creators are able to kind of cut out the middlemen and
Yeah.
market themselves, right? So in the past, you had to get a book deal. Today, you don't have to get a book deal to publish a book. And for that reason, yes, I think that there are more people who are maybe creating things on their own. And again, that's a great thing because you're getting a lot more out there. But as you get a lot more out there, there is going to be more junk in the mix. And I think one, I guess, aspect that I've noticed is that when I'm looking at a lot of creators online, I'm seeing a lot more today that are marketing themselves as experts at things they've never really done. And so maybe that is a like proxy as people are determining what follow or what people to follow or what products to buy. I mean, as an example, my book, as I mentioned, I've been working in that field
Hmm.
professionally, being paid to do that for years. A similar example is like Ali Abdal is someone who a lot of people look up for YouTube. He actually built his YouTube up to like, I think he's now at 2.5 million subscribers. And so he has the right, he's earned the right to say, I know how to build a YouTube
Yeah.
channel and I'm going to teach you to do that. And so I think that times to be wary are when someone is saying they're going to teach you something, but they haven't really done that themselves.
Hmm.
And so, like, I've seen a lot of creators, not calling anyone out in particular, who will say, like, I I'm going to teach you how to become a successful creator online, but it's almost like those like MLM schemes where it's like I'm a successful creator because I'm teaching you to be a successful
Yeah.
creator, who's then going to teach other people to be a successful creator. And so, not trying to hate on anyone in particular, but I think that's a good way to just vet people is like, have you done the thing that you say that you're going to teach me to do? And not to be so pessimistic because there's always going to be junk around, but just to maybe have like a keen eye for what you should be looking for.
Yeah. This exact thing gives me a lot of doubt about this podcast in a way, because I've now done a couple of almost 30 interviews, and I've learned a lot about self-publishing, and I'd love to publish something about self-publishing. I've not self-published myself. So I feel I don't have the authority to write this book.
Well, I guess I should say that it's not that you can't create things if you haven't done them before, but I would ask the question like if you want to write about self-publishing and you feel like you know something that others don't, why don't you self-publish first? Why don't you give that a shot and prove your, you know, your hypotheses?
Yeah.
And then from there you'll feel even more confident about writing what you're planning to write about because that was really important for me where like I think if I had written my book maybe 2 years before, I would have had a bunch of ideas about content and I would have probably been right about some of them, but I wouldn't have been right about a lot of them actually because I hadn't tested them, right? By the
Hmm.
time I wrote my book, I had again done all of these things professionally, tested a bunch of things, been wrong a bunch of times, gone down all of the rabbit holes that you would go down as you're trying to build content properties only to surface and be like, okay, now I know what's tried and true. Now I know what actually will work for other people. Versus if I had done it years before, as I said, I would have been right about far less things.
Hmm.
And maybe people would have still bought it and maybe people would have still said this is wonderful. But now when I have written my book, I feel really confident about what I'm putting out there because I've tested it myself.
Yeah. One of the things I like in your book and in your blog posts is, I think, what you call idea arbitrage, where you just get those different ideas from around the web. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so tied to what I was just speaking about, we have these ideas in life, and sometimes they're wonderful and sometimes they're not, but we often think they're wonderful when we first have them, right? We're like, oh my gosh, this is genius. No one's ever thought of this before. Let me put it out there. Even sometimes before we've experimented with it, validated it. And this idea of idea arbitrage is that when you get these seeds, you can actually imagine them to be like plants instead of just like going and selling the seeds, which are not worth very much because they haven't really been tested. Uh, go water them, go turn them into a plant. And the way that you do that is not by going and researching everything in a vacuum for 3 hours, but to let kind of the world validate it for you. And what I mean by that is as you're browsing Twitter or as you're reading other books or having conversations with your friends, that seed is in the back of your head. And if it is, and it's something that you're trying to validate, you will notice things. You will see other tweets that relate to that. You will
Mm.
read articles that relate to that. And you will be able to, over time, like either add to it and mature that idea, or sometimes you'll find that actually I've had this idea, and now that I'm really thinking about it, now that I'm seeing like what how other people are talking about it, this idea doesn't really have much weight. It doesn't really um,
Mhm.
hold its own. And so that's what I encourage people to do. And the article that I think you're referring to is my one about writing. It's about my entire writing
Yeah.
process, and
Mhm.
it's called Writing is Thinking. If people Google that, they'll probably find it. But yes, it's this idea where I think some people, because of the way that we were taught in school, think that writing an article is about like sitting down and writing that article from top to bottom in one sitting or two sittings. And I basically never do that. And often it'll be like 30 sittings, as crazy as that
Mhm.
sounds. And one sitting may be as simple as like dropping a tweet in there that relates to that article. But it's important for me to write down all these seeds, and I have hundreds of seeds now of things that I eventually want to write or talk about, and then adding things as I go, to the point where when I actually sit down and write that article, it's really easy because I have all of this information, but more important than the information, I've thought about it. I've like let it mature in my head to the point where when I'm sitting down, I'm very, very clear on what I'm actually trying to say.
Yeah. So all these examples, all these like tweets and articles that you refer to, and you include them in what you write.
Yes.
Did is that still idea arbitrage, or is that just like the considering if it's something you should talk about?
Well, I think it's all inclusive in the sense that I think this idea of like idea or information arbitrage is really sitting down and thinking through or expanding your initial seed, right? So growing it. And
Hmm.
part of growing it is thinking about it more yourself. So crystallizing it, but it's also, yeah, bringing in these different concepts from elsewhere that either can make its way into your writing, or what I do often include is the tweets itself, right? As like examples or pieces that can augment the article. Well, I try to, reinvent what they said, instead just insert what they said and obviously give them that credit because they encapsulated part of your point better than probably you could.
Yeah. Do you think that including those examples, those tweets, is part of your exposure strategy?
You know, maybe early on it was helpful because early on when I had no idea how to grow a blog, I do remember for a couple of my articles reaching out to a couple people and saying, "Hey, X person, I ended up including your tweet in my article. You might enjoy it." But I have to say that I don't think that ever actually drove any, volume or any traffic,
Hmm.
because most of the people that I was citing are big names already and they have no reason to share my article. And so that was not something that I think I included in doing content, right? Because it didn't really work. So this is an example of something I talked about before where I went down the rabbit hole of things that you could do to grow content. And then I came back up and said, these things work and these things don't work. And that was an example of something that, at least for me, did not really move the needle.
Yeah. So what did work to distribute this book?
So the book itself is different than, I'd say, most content that I did before. But the book itself, so yes, I had a Twitter following to start with.
Hmm.
The pricing strategy was helpful as well. That, as I mentioned, got a lot of different people sharing it. Even if they weren't buying the book, they were sharing pricing strategies, so doing some of the work for me. I also, there's like little things within the book that people wouldn't consider. But for example, having quotes within the book that are highlighted and similar to what Medium does,
Hmm.
um, they're like differentiated from the rest of the text, was very helpful because as people started to read it, they ended up sharing those exact quotes. I think I actually share that in the book itself, or maybe something I did after the book, where all of the quotes that people have
Hmm.
shared from the book are those quotes that were teased out. I also did an affiliate program that was helpful. I think also having that pre-sale, which I did. So basically, instead of just starting to sell one day, the pre-sale basically ended up providing 2 to 3 launches. So
Hmm.
basically, the first launch was, hey everyone, I'm creating this as a pre-sale. So that drove some interest. Then obviously I went created the book, and then when it was ready to launch, that generated another launch to say, hey, this is ready, and a bunch of other people rallied around it because they were the pre-buyers and they were happy to support. But then the cool part about that was that there was now this big cohort of people who were all reading it at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw maybe around 2 weeks later, there was a second, it wasn't so much a launch, but because of all of the awareness, or the people reading it and then sharing it and talking about it, there was almost like a third launch after that. And then there were several other launches. I launched on Product Hunt later, so there was many kind of iterative launches, and that was actually one of the concepts that I talk about in the book. Where, for example, ignore books for a second. A lot of people, when they're creating products, they think they have one opportunity to launch, and they're
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I need to master this Product Hunt launch, and they're approaching it from the mentality that Product Hunt or a specific launch will make or break my product success, and it should really be the opposite. The product itself should be so good, and you should kind of curate an audience around that first, so that when you go launch on something like Product Hunt, you already have a kind of encapsulated audience that's happy to support you. And that's actually something that I did with doing content right, where I launched it around a year later, once I had over 1,000, if not I think over 2,000 people who had read it or at least bought it
Mm-hmm.
and who liked it, so that when I went to launch on that platform, it was really, really easy. And I didn't even really have to prompt people. People were like, oh, I love this. Like, I'm going to support it. Versus in the past, when I had done Product Hunt launches, it was the opposite, where I was like, oh, I really hope this makes my product successful. Like, no
Mm-hmm.
one's heard of it. I hope people like it now. And so that's another, I guess, a quick point. But those were some of the things that helped the book gain traction. And I have to say that it's, again, these pointers are different for this book versus if you were just like launching a typical article. But
Mm-hmm.
I did obviously benefit as well from the audience that I had, the Twitter audience.
Yeah. Did you continue with the same strategies for doing time right, or are you trying something new?
Yeah, a lot of this same strategies. So it started as something that I was asked about a lot. A lot of people will come to me and they'll say, I want to create a book or a course. What should it be on? And the easiest way to determine what people want from you is to think through what they ask you for, right? So
Mm-hmm.
similar to people asking about content in the past, a lot of people throughout the last couple of years have said, hey, Steph, they're saying this about me. I'm not saying about myself. They're like, you're so prolific. How do I, create as much as you do? And ultimately I decided, well, I'm just going to productize this instead of answering every single person specifically. So that was similar in terms of productizing something that a lot of people asked me for. The pricing strategy was basically the same. It's different numbers, but tiered pricing that led up to a launch, a pre-sale. Doing time right was helpful because I had this large uh, group of buyers from doing content right. So thousands of people who liked the work and basically bought into the next product without blinking.
Mm-hmm.
And then I will say that again, because I have my financial stability elsewhere, I don't push these things in the same way as if I was doing this for a company. If I was doing this for a company, which is what I do, right,
Mm-hmm.
outside of these products, I would be driving paid ads to them. I'd be optimizing the landing pages and A/B testing them. I
Yeah.
would develop a much, much more comprehensive affiliate program. I would do outbound affiliates. I would probably create several almost like SEO pieces that would drive traffic that then would direct to those pages. And I haven't done most of those things because I'm not trying to like juice these
Yeah.
these products, and I'm quite happy with just however they've done a little more naturally. But I wanted to say that because if people are listening, they're like, what, like that's all she's done for growth? Like that's so basic, but it's intentional. Where again, if this was for a company, as I do for my work, there were many other things that I think people could leverage that I didn't actually use for these two products.
Yeah. And I also think that if you decided to go into paid ads and everything and really productize your books, you would not be able to offer the same community experience that you do now.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I am figuring out right now how to adjust the community because it started again as something where I'm like, I have no idea where this
Mm-hmm.
is going to go, and I expected maybe a couple hundred people to buy it, if that. And it's now been thousands of people. And so, for example, the DCR community chat has like almost 1,000 people in it now, and it started on Telegram for the reason that Telegram I think works for a certain size, but
Mm-hmm.
now it's too big, and so I'm debating where to move it. But yes, you're right that if I further juiced it with paid ads and started selling thousands more copies, then right now the infrastructure doesn't really work.
Yeah. And in a way, I think it would lose part of its value.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. All right. The final section I'd love to talk about is writing itself. So, the article that you've shared, of course, has a lot about your writing. But do you think there's like a superpower that you have as a writer that you've developed in the last couple of years?
No, I I definitely don't think so, and that's I think that's maybe a misconception that I also had before I started writing,
Hmm.
where if you think back to English class, which I think a lot of people base their affinity for writing or their
Hmm.
lack of affinity for writing on, basically English class teaches you how to write in a very specific way, but I think even more important than that, it forces you to write about topics that you don't care about. And so writing is this very arduous, unfun process or not fun process where you basically learn to hate that craft. Or I did, at least. I remember in my high school English was the only class that we had to take all the way through, and it was the one class that I disliked the most. And so it's funny now, 5, 10 years later, that I now write for a profession, or I have written as a profession. It's kind of wild to think about that change, and it's because now I have the ability to write in the ways that I want, but also I think, again, more importantly, about the topics that I want to write about. And it's coming from more of this place of like, I really have something to say. And when you really have something to say and you've thought about it for a long time, I mean, the article itself is called "Writing is Thinking."
Hmm.
Then writing is sometimes difficult, but sometimes it's really enjoyable and sometimes it really flows. And again, the article that I wrote on this topic talks through this idea where we're taught to write a certain way before, where we sit down and you bang out an essay and it's done and it's really not very enjoyable.
Hmm.
But instead, if you approach it from, let me talk about things that I know a lot about and let me give it the time to ruminate in my head, and to kind of cross reference with all of these other points, then when you sit down to write about this thing that you already know a lot about and that you've already processed, then if writing is thinking, thinking is also writing, in the sense that when if you've pre-thought something, the writing comes very, very naturally. And then I would say, like any skill, yes, over time I've gotten better at writing as I've done it more.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think that's actually another important takeaway for people, in that it's interesting that we tend to bucket certain skills as learnable and other skills as not learnable. But I think all skills are
Mhm.
learnable, and maybe you're just, you have a natural affinity to it when you start. But math, writing, coding, all of those things I think are extremely learnable, even though people tend to put them in buckets of like, I'm a good writer or I'm not, or I can code or I'm technical or I'm not. And so that is something to keep in mind. And I think I'm actually a great case study on that, in the sense that I truly not only hated writing, but I was not good at it. And so
Mhm.
if I have turned that around through the things that I've talked about, through talking about things that I care about and just doing more of it, then other people can do the same thing. So I'm not some special case, and I don't think really anyone else is, in terms of actually like being born a natural writer or not being born a natural writer.
Right. So over this last 40, 45 minutes, we've had a lot of tips about pricing, distributing. If you could give like a new writer, someone who wants to write their first book, 3 tips about writing itself, what would they be?
It's a good question. So you mean actually the craft of writing, or
Yeah,
about
the craft
creating
of
online?
writing and the idea of just sitting down at your desk and putting the words on paper on your screen.
So I guess I'll adjust that question in the sense that when it comes to actually putting words on your screen, if you're at that point, I don't have very many tips for you, because at that point, hopefully you've done the preparation before to think about the topics, to become an expert in something, to really think about how you're going to be differentiated. And then the words on the screen, or writing the words on the screen, should actually come very, very easily. And,
Mhm.
I could tell you, like, use some of the tools like Readwise or Draftback or whatever to like make that process easier. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I know tons of people who, write articles in a text editor, and other people who are using 50 different tools to make their writing process better. So I don't actually care as much about that, but I guess to give some tips on the precursor to sitting down in that desk. One of them is what we've talked about before. Make sure that if you're going to write about something, that you are an expert, and you don't have to be like the Olympic athlete of that particular space, but you know something very, very well. You've thought about it, and
Mhm.
you have almost like an angle to talk about that particular topic in a way that other people haven't. So, for example, it can be just as simple as you're just a lot funnier about that topic. You're a lot more deeply researched. You're contrarian in the way you talk about that topic. But in order to even get to those points of differentiation, you need to know that topic very well. So that's the first piece of feedback, or tip, is that you really should know about a topic a lot. And that also feeds into this idea of like being passionate about it and wanting to write it, and therefore the writing coming more easily. The second thing that I know, this is simple, but I would tell people not to overthink this whole writing process. And again, if you know something very, very well, it shouldn't be this like big elaborate thing where you have to read 50 books in order to figure out how to write about this thing effectively. You should know what the gaps are. The same way that I talked about remote work before, I knew what the gaps were because I had been in that space and I'd been studying it and I'd been reading all of the other information out there, and I noticed something. There was like a seed where I was like, there's stuff missing. And so you should have that same instinct as you're writing. If you're writing just to write, so I guess this would be the second tip, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I would caution people who kind of jump on the bandwagon where they say, oh, everyone has a newsletter, I'm going to create a newsletter, or
Hmm.
everyone has a podcast, I'm going to create a podcast. Because at the end of the day, all of these mediums, all of them are competitive. That does not mean that you can't succeed in them, but you do have to differentiate in some way. And so I would say that if you find yourself saying that as a person or a company, I see companies do this all the time where they're like, oh well, I guess it's time to have a blog. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, what do you have to say? Do you have something unique to say? So I guess that would be a second point. And then I'm trying to think through, I mean, I guess the third thing that I'll say is not specific to writing itself, but it relates to the long-term viability of writing, is that as unnatural it is as it is for many writers, you have to focus on distribution, and that distribution effort should be roughly equivalent to the time you spend writing. And you can
Hmm.
argue that it shouldn't be 50-50, maybe it should be 70-30 or whatever, but the point is what most people do when they create content is they spend 95, if not 99% of their effort creating that content, and then like the equivalent or the opposite of that in distributing their content. And ultimately, that's important to reverse or to balance out, because if you're not putting your work out there, no one's going to know about it. And I can bet you anything that even if you think you love writing, if you do it for a year and no one's reading your work,
Hmm.
you're going to give up and it's going to be really demoralizing. And I would just remind people, if they disagree with me on this topic, that the or your favorite artists, your favorite creators are probably good at creating. They may even be great at creating, but I can guarantee that they're great at distributing. That's how they've reached you. That's how you know about them. And there's a ton of other creators who are probably more talented than them, hiding in their basement, spending
Hmm.
all their time creating, but no time distributing. And you don't know who those people are. And so I would just remind people, I guess, as the third tip, even though it's not specific to writing, if you do want to write or if you do want to create, the balance to that creation is getting that work out there. So in the book we talk about many ways to do that, but that is an important tactic or way to frame things, that you have to invest in distributing even if that doesn't feel natural to you.
Yeah. So something like your three tips up, it would be an expert, differentiate, and distribute. Sure.
Yeah, I guess that's a short way to put it. But yes, although those sound simple, those are things that I think a lot of people skip over. For example, there are tons of people, as I said, who were like, let me just start a blog, and let me just start a blog about the thing that sounds popular right now that I don't know that much about. And let me just write 50 articles. And surely if I write these 50 articles, people are going to find them, and my work is going to speak for itself. And I would say that person is going to fail if I'm describing that situation. So I would say yes, a much better approach, even though it's very simple, is saying, what is everything that, or what are the things that I think about in the shower? Oh, I think about this thing, remote work, a lot. And actually, I think I'm maybe the 0.01% of people who know about this topic, who have done this for many years. Oh, actually, I read these articles and I think there's no one really talking about it in this way. Okay, I'm going to start there, and I'm not going to overthink it, and I'm not going to, you know, pick this topic that has the biggest TAM. I'm going to talk about something that I really know a lot about and I think I can differentiate with. And you know what? I'm going to create a blog because I think this is the best way to do it, not because everyone is starting a newsletter today. I think this is the best way for me to articulate this information. And then once I've created these articles, well, they're just going to sit on this blog if I just write 50 of them. So how do I actually get them to people? And again, this is maybe elementary stuff, but it's stuff that I see people skip over all the time. And they go more to that first example that I described instead of just thinking through, what do I know a shit ton about in a
Hmm.
way that I can differentiate with? And then how do I actually ensure that I'm baking in distribution into what I'm creating? And people make the same mistake with startups, right? They think if I build it, they'll come. And the reality is that they won't come if you don't actually invest in sharing it.
Yeah. It's funny actually because I think I started this podcast the other way around. It's more like what do I want to learn a ton about instead of what do I know a ton about. So I wanted to learn a lot about writing a book, and I started interviewing people about writing a book, and I think I've now come actually to a point where I know quite a lot about it, and maybe just what's missing is the actual experience of doing it.
Yeah, well, you'll do it. And I should say that, and I've mentioned this in other interviews that I've done before, and it's important in that everything I've said is if you are optimizing for building something and growing it, right? And optimizing for that growth. As I mentioned with my own projects, sometimes I don't even follow my own advice because I don't care about optimizing for growth and I just want to have fun with this. Or if someone wants to start a podcast and they're not an expert in something and they just want to have fun with it, great. But the advice that I'm giving is based on like if you really want to optimize for growth and you want to optimize um, for that aspect as a creator, that's the advice. But people can obviously deviate from that and be just as happy or just as successful in their own way. But again, that's the advice if people are optimizing for that part of being a creator.
Yeah. Speaking of optimizing for growth, for your projects, you've started a podcast as well. I think that's your most recent project.
Yes.
How do you tackle that in a similar way, or are you trying to distribute that a little bit more?
That's a great question. So, yes, my podcast is called The Shit You Don't Learn in School. I co host it with my partner, Calvin. And together, we started it as more of a passion project. You know, like we have certain things to say, let's
Mhm.
say them. And since we started getting traction and since I see a path to this being actually quite big, I am actively trying to grow it. So unlike doing content right and doing time right, we are actively trying to grow the
Mhm.
podcast. And I have to say that of all the things that I've grown in the past, the podcast is the hardest because the data or the attribution with podcasts is terrible. And in addition to the attribution, the shareability, the discoverability, like a lot of the infrastructure that exists with written content just isn't there. And in addition to that, the way that people listen to podcasts is differently. The example that I gave on the session that you're on is that people tend to listen to, on average, 6 podcasts and
Mhm.
then read many more than that newsletters, let's say maybe a dozen or 2 dozen newsletters throughout a year and then read hundreds, if not thousands, of blogs throughout a year. Now, they don't, they're not monogamous with those blogs. They're not reading every article on that blog, but they may read one article with one person, another article with another person, discover another one with Hacker News. And the point is that podcasts are basically the equivalent of your best friend versus a blog article is basically like that person that you sometimes see at a conference, right? So you're spending way less time with that person, and therefore you can interact with many more people at that level. But podcasts are extremely interesting in the way that you have that really deep relationship with your listeners in that they listen to you very often and for very long periods of time. I mean, you listen to people for like an hour, right? When you listen to a podcast. And so that's another added difficulty. It's
Mhm.
great once you get a podcast listener, but it's really hard to basically be the equivalent of someone's information best friend, right? Where they
Yeah.
have 6 of them and you're basically asking to be one of those 6
Mhm.
with your podcast. And so yes, we're actively trying to grow it right now, but it has been way more difficult than growing, newsletters or other platforms that I've done before.
Yeah. Uh, One of the things I've noticed that maybe it's because you started your podcast. Um, I think you speak pretty fast. Is that because you have your own podcast and you know that many podcasts are pretty slow and then it's like annoying to listen?
That's funny because I had someone DM me the other day and he was like, "Hey, I like your podcast, but you speak way too fast." And I was like, "Thank you." But it's definitely not because I'm trying to speak too fast, as in I do think that some podcasts can be slow, but the nice thing about podcasts is you can adjust the speed, right? So I
Right.
listen to most podcasts on 2x. So that probably plays more of a factor than me actually trying to speak quickly. But I think that's something that I've been told even prior to launching a podcast is that I speak really quickly. So maybe that's something that I need to work on probably, but it's not because I'm intentionally trying to speak quickly.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me. It's just something I noticed.
No, no, you're not the first one to notice, and it doesn't bother me to hear that feedback because it's something I've heard a lot of in the past or a decent amount of. And yeah, I mean, everyone's got, I'd much rather be told you speak way too quickly on your podcast than your podcast, isn't uninteresting or that you don't have anything interesting to say because this is much easier for me to fix than, than if it's just, hey, your podcast is actually just really bland and I don't like the things you have to say.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any secrets related to writing?
Secrets? I don't think so. I mean, I probably have some marketing secrets in the sense that the thing about marketing is that if you do find these like holes or hacks that truly other people haven't discovered, then sometimes, not always, it's a zero sum game in the sense that if I let everyone know that I'm doing X,
Mhm.
then if everyone starts doing the same thing, then we end up with an example is threading on Twitter, right? Like everyone's doing it today. I'm sure someone like 2 years ago was like, I found this really cool way to get engagement, and now everyone's doing it. And so there are probably some things that I've done with marketing that are like I am a little more secretive about, but I'd say
Mhm.
overall, I share almost everything that I learn, because I've learned that in most cases the world is a positive sum game, and that's why I have an open page where I share like exactly how much I'm making, how much I'm exercising, what books I'm reading. And I think one of the pieces that like really influenced my thinking on this like zero sum versus positive sum thinking is Derek Sivers' ideas versus execution framework. I'm sure many people are familiar with it. If they're not, you can Google it. But it's this idea that ideas are worth almost nothing, execution is everything. And if you really believe that, whether it's with writing, marketing, something completely different, then at the end of the day, if I share 100% of my ideas, which I think I actually come close to doing,
Mhm.
then I'm not really afraid of other people knowing about them, because if there's anything that I truly want to do, I believe that over the years I've like honed in on my execution skills, and therefore I can and should share all my ideas and not be afraid that someone's going to beat me or someone's going to steal something. And that's kind of the mentality that I've taken with my projects, which is why I'd say that yeah, I don't actually know if I have any secrets. If anything, I poured all of my ideas about the subject into that book or into the articles I've written about it.
Yeah. So maybe just this full transparency is the secret.
Maybe. I mean, a lot of people talk about building in the open, but I do think that yeah, it's one of the things that especially early on when I didn't have an audience, because at one point I didn't, right? That's
Mhm.
important to remember. Everyone who you know, whether it's Kanye West or the biggest TikTok star in the world, at one point had zero audience, zero people knowing about them. And I started from that same place, and building in the open was one of the ways that I was able to build something, because that was new or that was different. A lot of people don't build in the open, and that is one way that you can very easily differentiate yourself from everything else out there.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Perfect. Is there anything else people should know about you, about your books?
No, I mean, I think we shared a lot of it doing content, right? Wrote it 2020. It's done, I think, almost 4,000 copies now, which is super cool. And doing time right has done pretty well as well. I think we're nearing, I think we're around 800 buys, maybe more than that. I should check. And then, yeah, the podcast, we just hit a new milestone of, oh, we're actually over 850 for doing time right. And then the podcast, we just hit a milestone of 10,000 downloads a month, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Where can
Yeah.
they find out about all of these books and the podcast?
Yeah. So the place I'm most active is Twitter. My handle is Steph Smith IO, because my website is stephsmith.io, where you can find all of these, but you can also find the book at doingcontentright.com, the course at doingtimeright.com, and then the podcast. As I said, we are actively trying to grow. People can find it at listenandlearn.co, or it's called The Shit You Don't Learn in School if people search that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.